Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The thermal imaging made no sense. 3 heat signatures moving in perfect geometric formation, each one registering 12 degrees below zero. Robert Fitzgerald lowered the FLIR Scout and rubbed his eyes, convinced the device had malfunctioned. October in Ile Royale meant temperatures hovering around 45 degrees, sometimes dipping to freezing at night, but nothing that would produce sub-zero readings, certainly not from living creatures. He checked the calibration settings, ran the diagnostic sequence twice, then raised the scope again. The signatures were gone. He stood at the edge of the Greenstone Ridge Trail, mile marker 14, elevation 1,394 feet, according to his Garmin eTrex. The morning sun filtered through white pine and paper birch, casting long shadows across the trail. His breath formed small clouds in the October air. Everything appeared normal, routine, the kind of crisp autumn morning that had drawn him to the National Park Service 12 years ago. Except for the thermal readings. Except for the call that had brought him here. Ashley Nguyen had been missing for 72 hours. 26 years old, experienced backcountry hiker, proper permits, appropriate gear. She'd checked in via satellite phone on Monday evening from her camp near Siskiwit Lake, mentioned she was heading north toward Feldman Ridge. Tuesday morning, her emergency beacon activated for exactly 47 seconds before going silent. No distress message, no follow-up signal. Robert had documented every detail in his field notebook, the same leather-bound moleskin he'd carried since his first season at Yellowstone. Date, time, coordinates, weather conditions, equipment manifest. He approached every search and rescue operation the same way, methodical, thorough, emotion removed from the equation. Facts led to conclusions. Data produced results. The NPS had assigned him to Ile Royale 3 months ago, a lateral move from Grand Teton that he'd requested specifically for the isolation. Fewer tourists, less drama, more time for serious wildlife research. The island sat in Lake Superior like a fortress, accessible only by seaplane or ferry, 45 miles from the nearest mainland shore. The park covered 850 square miles of designated wilderness, home to precisely 28 gray wolves and roughly 1,600 moose, populations he tracked with the kind of precision others reserved for financial portfolios. He'd partnered with Sarah Blackwood, the only other ranger stationed at the Wendigo headquarters on the island's western shore. She'd grown up in Duluth, knew Superior's moods like some people knew their siblings. When the beacon alert came through, she'd immediately checked the weather data. "Front moving in from the northwest," she'd said, pointing at the barometric readings on her laptop. "We've got maybe 36 hours before conditions deteriorate." Robert had nodded, already calculating grid search patterns, optimal coverage routes, statistical probability zones based on Ashley's last known position and typical hiker behavior patterns. Now, standing alone on the Greenstone Ridge with impossible thermal readings, he felt the first whisper of something that might have been unease, though he immediately categorized and dismissed it. Equipment malfunction, temperature inversion, some logical explanation that would reveal itself with proper investigation. He continued north, following the trail toward Ashley's last known coordinates. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense undergrowth of thimbleberry and hobblebush beneath the canopy. His boots crunched on fallen leaves, the sound loud in the morning stillness. He'd left Wendigo headquarters at 0530 hours, wanted to cover the primary search zone before the day warmed up and scent trails degraded further. The trail curved east following the ridgeline. Robert paused every 100 yards to document conditions: soil moisture, vegetation disturbance, animal tracks. He photographed everything with his Canon PowerShot, recorded GPS coordinates in his notebook. At mile marker 16, he found the first sign. A paper birch roughly 8 inches in diameter, stripped of bark in a spiral pattern. The exposed wood underneath showed deep gouges, parallel marks that looked almost like claw marks, except they ran vertically for 6 feet up the trunk. Too high for any animal on the island. too deliberate to be storm damage. He photographed it from 4 angles, measured the gouge depths with his pocket tool, 3/4 of an inch, consistent spacing, added detailed notes to his documentation. Possible bear activity, except Isle Royale had no bears. The last confirmed sighting had been in 1952. 200 yards further, he found another marked tree, then another. 5 trees total, all paper birch, all stripped in the same spiral pattern, all with those impossibly high vertical gouges. Robert stopped at the 5th tree, running his fingers across the exposed wood. The gouges were fresh, sap still tacky. He checked his thermometer, 48 degrees, rising with the morning sun. But when he touched the marked bark, his fingers came away numb with cold. He pulled his hand back, stared at his fingertips. They'd gone white, bloodless, as if he'd plunged them into ice water. Feeling returned slowly, painful pinpricks of circulation. He touched the tree again, same result. The wood around the gouges radiated cold that his thermometer couldn't register. Document it. That was the protocol. He photographed his hand against the tree, recorded the temperature discrepancy, noted the physiological response. Facts. Data. Conclusions would follow. The trail descended toward Siskiwit Lake, switchbacking through thicker forest. Robert checked his GPS. Ashley's last satellite call had originated from coordinates half a mile ahead, on the lake's northern shore. He increased his pace, boots finding purchase on the rocky trail, breath coming faster now with exertion. He smelled the camp before he saw it. The odor hit him at 100 yards out, something chemical and organic at once, like formaldehyde mixed with spoiled meat. Robert pulled his radio, keyed the transmit button. Wendigo Dispatch, Fitzgerald. I've located what appears to be Nguyon's campsite. Requesting backup and medical response, over. Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing but white noise. The radio had worked fine an hour ago. He checked the battery indicator. Full charge. Cycled through all 6 emergency frequencies. Dead air on every channel. Robert clipped the radio back to his belt, pulled out his satellite phone. No signal. Impossible. The device was rated for global coverage, line of sight to multiple satellites. He moved into a clearing, raised the phone toward open sky. The screen displayed, searching, indefinitely. He documented the equipment failure in his notebook, added the time and location. Then he approached the camp. Ashley Nguyen had set up her tent in a small clearing 50 feet from the lake shore, a smart location with access to water and a natural windbreak from the surrounding spruce. The tent itself, a MSR Hubba Hubba 2-person backpacking model, stood intact, fly secured, stakes properly set. But everything else was wrong. Her gear had been arranged in a perfect circle around the tent, not scattered by animals or wind, but placed with deliberate precision. Backpack at north, sleeping bag at east, cooking equipment at south, water filtration system at west. Each item exactly equidistant from the tent's center, measured spacing that would have required tools to achieve. Robert pulled latex gloves from his pack, approached the circle slowly. He photographed the layout from multiple angles, sketched it in his notebook with measurements. The arrangement was too precise to be accidental, too methodical to be the work of an animal. He examined each item without disturbing the pattern. The backpack showed no signs of damage, no claw marks, no tears, zippers all closed. The sleeping bag lay perfectly flat, as if someone had taken time to smooth every wrinkle. The camp stove sat upright, fuel canister properly attached, but when Robert checked the gauge, it read completely empty despite Ashley's supply manifest indicating she'd brought a full canister. The tent door hung open. Robert knelt at the entrance, peered inside. More geometry. Ashley's clothing had been folded and stacked in a pyramid. Shirts at the base, pants in the middle, jacket on top. Her hiking boots sat beside the pyramid, laces tied in identical bows. Her headlamp hung from the tent's center loop, turned on, but emitting no light despite fresh batteries visible in the casing. And on the tent floor, drawn in what looked like ash, a symbol. Robert had seen hundreds of indigenous petroglyphs and pictographs during his career, but nothing like this. The symbol consisted of concentric circles surrounding a spiral, with 6 lines radiating outward like spokes. Something about the proportions made his eyes hurt, made him want to look away even as he forced himself to photograph it. He backed out of the tent, stood up too quickly. Dizziness swept through him, vision graying at the edges. He bent forward, hands on knees, forcing breath into his lungs. The chemical smell was stronger here, making his eyes water. When his vision cleared, he saw the journal. It sat outside the circle, placed on a flat stone 30 feet from the tent. A standard field notebook, identical to his own, the kind NPS Rangers carried for trip documentation. Robert approached it carefully, photographing it in situ before picking it up. Ashley Nguyen's handwriting covered the pages, entries dated from the previous week. The first several pages detailed normal hiking observations, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather notes. Then the tone shifted. October 16th. Heard something following me today. Stayed just outside of visual range, but I could hear it moving parallel to the trail, large based on the sound of brush displacement. Possibly moose, though movement pattern seems wrong. Stopped when I stopped. Started when I started. October 17th. The following continued all day. Managed one clear glimpse. Tall, much taller than a moose. Pale, moved wrong, like joints bending in directions they shouldn't. Probably just exhaustion playing tricks. Need to hydrate more. October 18th. It spoke to me last night. I know how that sounds, but I heard it clearly. Voice coming from the forest beyond my tent. It spoke in a language I don't know, but somehow I understood. It said it was hungry. It said it had been hungry for so long. It asked if I understood hunger. October 19th. I'm so hungry. Ate all my food yesterday, but I'm still hungry. The hunger is different now, deeper. It's not in my stomach. It's in my bones, my teeth. I can feel it in my jaw, aching to close on something, anything. I tried to catch fish from the lake, but my hands were shaking too badly. The thing, I saw it again today, closer this time. Antlers, I think, or bones growing from its head, eyes that don't reflect light, just absorb it. October 20th. I understand now. The hunger is a gift. The hunger makes you pure. The hunger strips away everything unnecessary, emotion, memory, desire, until only the essential remains. Feed, consume, grow. I met someone on the trail today, another hiker. Wanted to tell them about the hunger, about how beautiful it is once you accept it. But they ran. They always run. October 21st. I can hear it calling my name. My real name. The one even I don't remember anymore. It knows what I am, what I'm becoming. The cold helps. The cold slows the change, makes it last longer. I've been lying in the lake water for hours, watching the surface freeze around me. Ice forms in patterns, did you know that? Geometric patterns that echo the symbol. Everything echoes the symbol. The symbol is the hunger made visible. October 22nd. I don't need to eat anymore. The hunger has moved beyond food. It consumes something else now. Something that comes from living things when they realize what's going to happen to them. Fear has a taste, did you know that? It tastes like copper and salt and electricity. I tasted it from the hiker yesterday. Just a little. Just enough to understand. They're probably dead now. Or becoming. It's hard to tell the difference. The entries stopped there. Robert stood holding the journal, hands trembling despite his attempts at clinical detachment. He forced himself to read through the passages again, looking for signs of drug use, mental illness, any rational explanation for the deterioration documented in Ashley's increasingly erratic handwriting. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations. Dehydration affected judgment. Possible contamination in her food supply, bacterial or fungal compounds that could produce psychotropic effects. But none of that explained the camp's geometric arrangement. None of that explained the cold radiating from the marked trees. None of that explained the impossible thermal readings he'd documented that morning. Robert pulled his compass from his pocket, the mechanical Silva model that never needed batteries. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north, circling the dial in smooth rotations that defied every principle of magnetism. He snapped the compass shut, shoved it back in his pocket. Document. Analyze. Conclude. The protocol remained the same regardless of circumstances. He bagged the journal as evidence, marked the location, sketched the camp layout with painstaking detail. He collected soil samples from inside and outside the circle, photographed the ash symbol from multiple angles, measured the exact dimensions of the gear placement. The morning had worn into afternoon, temperature climbing to 52 degrees according to his thermometer. But Robert felt cold creeping into his bones. His fingers had gone numb despite the mild weather. His breath came visible in clouds that shouldn't form in 50-degree air. He needed to return to Wendigo headquarters, report findings, coordinate an expanded search operation with proper support. Ashley Nguyen was clearly in crisis, possibly injured or incapacitated, certainly suffering from exposure and psychological breakdown. The journal suggested she'd encountered another hiker. If that entry had any basis in reality, there might be additional victims requiring rescue. Robert turned to leave the camp, then stopped. Footprints, bare footprints in the soft soil near the lake shore, heading north along the water's edge. He'd checked that area twice already, had photographed it as part of his site documentation. The footprints hadn't been there before. He approached them slowly. The prints were elongated, stretched, each one at least 16 inches long with toes splayed wider than human anatomy allowed. They pressed deep into the mud, suggesting significant weight, but the stride length was impossible, nearly 12 feet between prints. Robert knelt beside the nearest footprint, removed his measuring tape. 16.5 inches, 4 inches wide at the ball of the foot, 6 inches across the toes. He photographed it with his camera, placed his own boot beside it for scale comparison. The footprint was cold. Not just cool, but radiating the same impossible chill he'd felt from the marked trees. Ice crystals formed along the edges of the impression, spreading slowly across the mud despite the afternoon warmth. He stood up, looked north along the trail of prints. They led into thick forest, disappearing into shadows beneath the spruce canopy. Something moved in those shadows. Robert's rational mind tried to classify it. Angle of sunlight through branches, wind-moved foliage, simple optical illusion. But the movement had been too deliberate, too coordinated. Something tall, pale, standing absolutely still just beyond the edge of clear vision. "Ashley Nguyen," he called out, voice steady despite the cold spreading through his chest. "This is Ranger Robert Fitzgerald with the National Park Service. I'm here to help you. If you can hear me, please respond." Silence. The forest had gone completely quiet, Robert realized. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through leaves. Just absolute stillness. Then, from the shadows, a voice. "Do you understand hunger, Robert?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to localize. It spoke in English, but beneath the words Robert heard something else. Syllables from a language that predated language, sounds that human throats weren't designed to produce. "Ashley, you need medical attention. You're experiencing hypothermia, possibly hallucinations. I have emergency supplies, heat packs, water with electrolytes. Please come out where I can see you." "She's not here anymore," the voice said. She understood. She accepted. Now there's just the hunger. The thing stepped into the light. Robert's mind rejected what he saw, tried to impose familiar patterns on alien geometry. He saw antlers, but they were too white, too smooth, growing from a skull that stretched vertically in proportions that violated every principle of skeletal architecture. He saw limbs, but they bent wrong, extra joints creating angles that made his eyes water. He saw skin, but it was translucent, revealing organs that pulsed with movement that had nothing to do with breathing or circulation. And he saw Ashley Nguyen's face, stretched across that impossible skull like a mask worn too tight. She was so hungry, the thing said with Ashley's mouth. Starving herself all her life, always running, always burning, never feeding. The hunger was already there. I just helped her understand it. Robert's hand moved to his radio automatically, training overriding terror. The device was still dead. His satellite phone remained signalless. He was alone, 6 miles from headquarters, facing something his rational mind insisted couldn't exist. "You're not real," he said, voice barely steady. Stress response, pattern recognition failure, possibly airborne hallucinogen in the local fungal population. The thing laughed, sound like breaking ice. "That's beautiful," it said. "That's exactly what she said. You document, you measure, you categorize, building walls of data against the dark. But the dark doesn't care about your numbers, Robert. The hunger doesn't care about your protocols." It moved closer, each step covering impossible distance, body flowing across the ground in ways that violated physics. The cold intensified, spreading from the creature in waves. Ice formed on the nearby trees, crystals spreading in spiral patterns that echoed the symbol in Ashley's tent. Robert backed toward the lakeshore, hand moving to his belt, finding the canister of bear spray, useless against something that wasn't a bear, but his training gave him the movement, the familiar weight of the device in his palm. "Do you want to know the truth about hunger, Robert?" The thing wearing Ashley's face tilted its head, antlers catching sunlight, scattering it in directions light didn't normally travel. "Hunger is the only honest thing. Everything else, love, duty, curiosity, all those things you think make you human, they're just elaborate decorations around the basic truth. You hunger, therefore you are." "You're describing addiction," Robert said, medical training providing words when his mind failed. "Psychological compulsion, reinforcement of destructive behavioral patterns." "I'm describing existence," the creature interrupted. "The wolf hungers, so it hunts. The tree hungers, so it grows. The stone hungers, so it waits." Ashley understood. Deep down, past all her walls, she knew. She'd been running from the hunger her whole life, and when she finally stopped, when she finally accepted, it spread its arms, bones crackling with the movement. She became free. Robert's thumb found the safety on the bear spray. "What happened to the other hiker, the one Ashley mentioned in her journal?" "Growing," the creature said. "Changing. There's a camp 3 miles east, near Hidden Lake. You should check on them. You're very thorough, Robert. Very methodical. You'll want to document their transformation properly. There are more of you. More of us," it corrected. Ashley understood. "I'm not separate from her. I'm what she always was, under the training and discipline and control, the hunger that drives every living thing. I just helped her see it clearly." The creature took another step, close enough now that Robert could see Ashley's eyes staring out from that stretched face, could see recognition in those pupils, could see something that might have been her consciousness still present, trapped in a body that had been reshaped by something ancient and terrible. "What are you?" Robert asked, the question emerging despite his attempts at clinical detachment. "Names are difficult," the creature said. "Your species has dozens of them. Wendigo, the Ojibwe called us. Wendigo, Witico, names for the hunger that walks, for the cold that consumes. We've been here longer than your kind. We'll be here after you're gone. We're patient, we're persistent, and we're always, always hungry." It lunged. Robert fired the bear spray stream of oleoresin capsicum, hitting the creature directly in the face. It didn't even slow down. Claws, impossibly long, bone-white, raked across his chest, shredding his jacket, scoring lines across his ribs. He stumbled backward, boots finding empty air, and fell. The lake water hit him like a wall, temperature somewhere in the 40s, cold enough to trigger instant gasping reflex. Robert plunged under, vision blurring, lake bottom dropping away beneath him into darkness that seemed far too deep for Siskiwit Lake's documented depth of 40 feet. He kicked upward, broke surface, gasped air. The creature stood on the shore, watching with Ashley's eyes. "The water won't save you," it called. "Nothing will. But you can still choose. You can understand the hunger, accept it, let it make you clean. Or you can fight and starve, and eventually beg for what I'm offering freely now." Robert swam for shore, 30 feet of frigid water seeming like 30 miles. His muscles cramped, hypothermia setting in fast. Behind him, he heard splashing, looked back to see the creature entering the water, moving through it like it was air. He reached shore at a different point, pulled himself onto rocks, lungs burning, body shaking. His GPS had survived the dunking, waterproof to 90 feet, showing coordinates 200 yards southeast of Ashley's camp. He ran. The forest blurred around him, rational thought replaced by pure survival instinct. His training screamed at him to stop, to establish position, to signal for help. But his radio was dead, his sat phone useless, and something impossible was hunting him through terrain he'd thought he understood. Robert ran until his legs gave out, collapsing against a granite outcrop a mile from the lake. He pulled his emergency supplies, stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped himself in the space blanket. His hands shook too badly to hold his notebook, but he forced himself to document, to maintain the protocol that had defined his career. The entries were barely legible, handwriting degraded by cold and fear, but he recorded everything. The creature's appearance, Ashley's transformation, the impossible physics of its movement. He dated each entry, noted precise times, GPS coordinates, facts, data. Some rational explanation existed, must exist, would reveal itself with proper analysis. The sun descended toward the western horizon, temperature dropping fast. October in Isle Royale meant nightfall by 7 p.m., full darkness by 8. Robert had 4 hours of daylight remaining, 6 miles to Wendigo headquarters, no functional communication equipment. He inventoried his supplies. Emergency blanket, water purification tablets, energy bars, first aid kit, flashlight with spare batteries, lighter, 50 feet of paracord, standard SAR loadout, adequate for typical rescue scenarios, completely inadequate for this. Robert stood, body still trembling from the lake water, and started moving. Not running, that would exhaust him too quickly, but a steady walking pace that covered ground while conserving energy. He followed his GPS, heading southwest toward headquarters, staying on established trails when possible. The marked trees appeared everywhere now. He passed dozens of stripped birches, each one bearing those vertical gouges, each one radiating cold that his thermometer couldn't measure. The spiral pattern repeated, carved into bark, scratched into stone, traced in arrangements of fallen leaves. The symbol from Ashley's tent, the hunger made visible. At mile marker 12, he found the second camp, another tent, another geometric arrangement of gear, another journal left sitting on a stone. Robert approached it like a crime scene, documenting everything despite his shaking hands, despite the growing awareness that documentation might not matter, that his carefully recorded observations might never be seen by anyone who could help. The journal belonged to James Hardwick, 34, solo hiker from Minneapolis. His entries followed the same pattern as Ashley's, normal documentation degrading into paranoia, paranoia transforming into acceptance, acceptance becoming something worse. The final entry, dated yesterday, "The hunger is beautiful. Why did we ever think it was something to deny? I can feel my body changing, bones lengthening, skin tightening. It hurts, but the pain is proof I'm becoming something more honest. The cold helps. The cold makes the transformation last longer. I want it to last forever." Robert bagged the journal, added it to the growing evidence in his pack. 2 confirmed transformations, possibly more. The creature had mentioned a camp near Hidden Lake, 3 miles east from Ashley's location, which meant... He checked his map. Hidden Lake sat isolated in the island's interior, accessible only by a poorly maintained trail. If there was another camp there, another transformation, that meant at least 3 victims, 3 that he knew about. The thought crystallized slowly through his hypothermic confusion. Ashley's journal mentioned encountering another hiker on October 21st, 4 days ago. James Hardwick's journal was dated through October 23rd, yesterday. How many other hikers had come through Isle Royale in the past week? How many had encountered the creatures? How many were transforming right now, bones lengthening, skin stretching, hunger replacing humanity? Robert's radio crackled to life. "It's Gerald, do you copy? Fitzgerald, please respond. We have thermal anomalies showing multiple..." Sarah Blackwood's voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static, then by something else. A sound like breathing, but with too many frequencies, too much depth. And underneath that, almost inaudible, whispered words in a language that made Robert's teeth ache. He turned off the radio, removed the battery, threw both pieces into the underbrush. Whatever the things were, they could use electronics somehow, could reach through the devices that were supposed to connect him to safety. The sun touched the horizon. Shadows lengthened, temperature plummeted. Robert checked his thermometer, 38 degrees and dropping fast. Faster than meteorologically possible, weather patterns warping around the creature's presence. He walked faster, breath coming in visible clouds, extremities numbing despite his attempts to maintain circulation. 2 miles to Wendigo headquarters, 2 miles to heat, shelter, communication equipment that might still function. The things appeared on both sides of the trail. 4 of them, maybe 5, standing among the trees in that absolute stillness that living creatures couldn't maintain. Too tall, too pale, bones and antlers catching twilight, eyes absorbing light without reflecting it. Each one wore a face, not perfectly, not completely, but enough for Robert to recognize them. Ashley Nguyen, James Hardwick, a woman he didn't know, a teenage boy, a man his own age. They watched him pass, didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with expressions that had nothing human left in them. Robert kept walking, forcing his legs to move at a steady pace, refusing to run, knowing that running would trigger pursuit. Predator response? He'd studied it, documented it in wolves and bears and cougars. Show fear, show weakness, and they strike. The creatures let him pass. Half a mile to headquarters. The trail descended toward the lakeshore, following the rocky beach. Superior stretched away to the north, water dark under gathering clouds. Weather front moving in, just like Sarah had predicted. 36 hours, she'd said. That was 72 hours ago. Had it really been 3 days? Time felt unstable, stretched and compressed like Ashley's face on that impossible skull. Wendigo headquarters appeared through the trees. A cluster of buildings huddled against the shore, lights visible in the windows, generator humming its familiar rhythm. Robert stumbled toward it, professional detachment finally crumbling, legs nearly giving out on the last 100 yards. The door was locked. He pounded on it, yelled Sarah's name. No response. He circled the building, checking windows, looking for movement inside. The lights were on. The computer monitors glowed in the operations room, but no one was there. Robert broke a window, climbed through, landed on the operations room floor in a shower of glass. The heating system was running, pushing warm air through the vents, but the warmth felt wrong somehow, inadequate, unable to penetrate the cold that had sunk into his bones. He found Sarah's jacket hanging on her chair. Her coffee mug sat on the desk, still half full, cold. Her computer showed the last website she'd accessed, a page about Ojibwe folklore, specifically entries on Wendigo psychosis. Wendigo psychosis. Robert had read about it during his graduate work in cultural anthropology, a culture-specific syndrome observed in Algonquian communities, characterized by intense craving for human flesh, fear of becoming cannibalistic, associated with severe isolation and resource scarcity. Most anthropologists categorized it as a psychological response to extreme environmental stress. But what if they were wrong? What if the syndrome wasn't psychological at all, but an infection, a transformation, something real that indigenous communities had observed and documented for centuries, while Western science dismissed it as superstition? Robert pulled up the browser history, followed Sarah's research trail. She'd spent hours reading about Wendigo encounters, about traditional methods of dealing with the possessed, about the Cree practice of binding and relocating affected individuals, about the Ojibwe belief that some hungers couldn't be satisfied, only contained. Her final search, timestamped 2 hours ago, how to kill a Wendigo. The results were contradictory. Some sources claimed fire was the only solution, that the creatures had to be burned completely, reduced to ash, or they'd regenerate. Others insisted on specific rituals, ceremonies that required knowledge passed down through generations. A few suggested that transformation was permanent, that there was no cure, only prevention. Robert documented everything, photographing Sarah's research, downloading files to a USB drive. Protocol, evidence, the rational framework that had sustained him through 12 years of dangerous rescues, fatal accidents, emergency crisis management. The framework was cracking. He checked the emergency radio equipment, the satellite uplink, the cell phone booster. All dead, showing power but producing only static, as if something had severed the connections between the island and the rest of reality. Robert pulled up the thermal imaging system, the same equipment that had shown him those impossible readings that morning. The screen displayed dozens of signatures around the headquarters, each one registering below zero, each one standing perfectly still in a geometric pattern that echoed the symbol from Ashley's tent. They'd surrounded the building. He switched to the security cameras, 12 different feeds showing different angles around the compound. Every camera showed the creatures, standing motionless, faces visible in the gathering darkness. Ashley Nguyen, James Hardwick, the unknown woman, the teenage boy, the middle-aged man, and Sarah Blackwood. She stood directly in front of the main door, close enough that Robert could see the transformation hadn't completed yet. Her face still looked mostly human, features stretched but recognizable. But her eyes, even through the grainy camera feed, Robert could see her eyes had changed, pupils expanding until no white remained, just darkness that absorbed light without reflecting it. She looked directly at the camera. "Robert," she said, voice carrying perfectly through the door despite no visible speaker system. "It's not what you think. It's not bad. It's clarity. It's understanding. It's finally being honest about what we are." Robert backed away from the monitors, mind trying to process, to categorize, to maintain some framework of understanding. "I fought it," Sarah continued, "for hours. Tried to rationalize, to explain it scientifically. Just like you're doing now. But there's no science that covers this, Robert. This predates science. This is older than humanity, older than consciousness. This is the foundation everything else is built on." The creatures moved closer, visible through the windows now, faces pressing against glass. "You're hungry too," Sarah said. "You've always been hungry. Hungry for knowledge, for understanding, for control over chaos. Different hunger than Ashley's, different than mine, but hunger nonetheless. We're all starving in our own ways. This just makes it visible." Robert grabbed his notebook, forced his trembling hands to write. Documentation, evidence, facts and observations that might help someone someday understand what had happened here. But even as he wrote, part of him whispered that no one would read these notes, that the weather front would isolate the island for days, maybe weeks, that by the time help arrived, everyone on Isle Royale would be transformed or dead, or fled into the forest to hunt and hunger forever. "Come outside," Sarah called. "Face it, accept it, or spend your last hours hiding, pretending your numbers and notes mean something against the dark." Robert checked the emergency supplies, found the flare gun, loaded it with shaking hands. Fire. Multiple sources had mentioned fire. Maybe that would work. Maybe it would just make things worse, but he had to try something. Had to maintain agency against the transformation creeping through the island. He smashed another window, aimed the flare gun at the nearest creature, fired. The flare hit Ashley Nguyen's transformed body directly in the chest, burning magnesium igniting her translucent skin. She screamed, sound like ice breaking, like bones snapping, and fell backward into snow that hadn't been there a moment ago. Snow, in October. On the ground, accumulating fast, temperature plummeting through freezing towards zero. The other creatures moved, smooth coordinated motion, converging on the headquarters. Robert loaded another flare, fired through a different window, hit the teenage boy in the shoulder. Same result, burning, screaming, retreat. But there were too many of them, and he had only 6 flares. He retreated to the interior office, barricaded the door with filing cabinets, shoved his notes and recordings into his pack. The walls wouldn't hold for long, but maybe long enough for him to what? Run? Hide? Transform the horror of the past 3 days into neat documentation that no one would ever read? Robert sat on the floor, back against the barricade, notebook open on his lap. He forced himself to think like a scientist, to categorize observations, to look for patterns. Fact: the creatures radiated cold. Measurable, consistent, defying thermodynamic principles. Fact: they communicated through electronic devices, suggesting either electromagnetic manipulation or sophisticated mimicry. Fact: fire caused them pain, possibly permanent damage. Fact: transformation appeared to be progressive, requiring multiple days, triggered by some combination of isolation, environmental stress, and the creature's proximity. Fact: Ashley's journal mentioned accepting the hunger. Sarah had used similar language, implying psychological component, vulnerability to suggestion or infection. Conclusion: the creatures might be psychosomatic manifestations given physical form through... No. That was rationalization, attempting to impose scientific framework on something that violated science's basic assumptions. The creatures weren't psychological. They weren't manifestations. They were real, physical, dangerous. They were Wendigo. The barricade shuddered, filing cabinet scraping across floor. Robert grabbed the flare gun, loaded his fourth flare, aimed at the door. The door exploded inward, wood splintering, metal hinges shrieking. Sarah Blackwood stepped through. Transformation nearly complete now. Body elongated, joints bending wrong, antlers beginning to emerge from her skull like bones breaking through skin. "Please don't make this harder," she said, voice layered with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "The pain of fighting is worse than the pain of accepting." Robert fired. The flare caught her in the face, magnesium burning at 3,000 degrees. Sarah's scream shattered the windows, sound physically painful, making Robert's ears ring. She fell backward, clawing at her burning face, and the other creatures rushed in to drag her away. 2 flares left. Robert ran, abandoning the barricade, heading for the back exit. He burst through into the October night, except it wasn't October anymore, not according to the evidence of his senses. Snow fell thick and fast, already 6 inches accumulated, temperature somewhere far below zero. His breath crystallized instantly, ice forming on his eyelashes. The forest waited, dark and infinite. Behind him, the headquarters burned where the flare had ignited fuel storage. Ahead, creatures moved through the trees, pale forms in falling snow, surrounding him in geometric patterns that his mind insisted meant something, some underlying mathematics to their arrangement. Robert chose a direction, south, toward the ferry dock, toward some theoretical possibility of escape, and ran. The creatures followed, not chasing exactly, more like herding, keeping him moving in a specific direction, cutting off routes that would take him toward the shore. Robert altered course, heading east, and they shifted position smoothly, blocking that path too. West brought the same result. They were driving him north, deeper into the island's interior, away from any possible rescue. Robert stopped running, gasping in the frigid air, lungs burning. His thermometer had shattered at some point, but the cold was far beyond any instrument's measurement. Superior cold, they called it. The kind that killed in minutes, that turned flesh black, that stopped hearts. Yet Robert was still alive, still conscious, still able to think despite the hypothermia that should have incapacitated him hours ago. "Why am I not dead?" he shouted into the falling snow. "Why haven't you killed me?" Sarah emerged from the trees ahead, face still smoking from the flare burn but healing, skin knitting itself back together in time-lapse motion. "Because you're not food," she said. "You're becoming." "No." Robert backed away, hand reaching for the flare gun. 1 shot left. "I'm not accepting this. I'm not transforming. You're starving," Sarah interrupted. "Can't you feel it? The hunger growing? You've been denying it for days now, using your protocols and documentation as walls against the truth. But the walls are crumbling, Robert. You can feel them crumbling." And he could. That was the horror of it. He could feel something growing in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth, a hollowness that food wouldn't satisfy, that warmth couldn't fill, an aching void that whispered terrible promises about what it would take to make it stop. "That's the hypothermia," he said, voice shaking. Physiological response to extreme cold, diminished cognitive function, hallucination. That's hunger, Sarah said gently, almost kindly. The same hunger that drove you to become a park ranger, to spend your life documenting and cataloging and trying to understand nature. You thought you were studying the wilderness, Robert. You were feeding on it, consuming its mysteries, its patterns, its secrets. We all hunger. You just haven't been honest about what you're hungry for. Robert raised the flare gun, aimed at her transformed face. Stay back. Or what? You'll burn me? I'll heal. They always heal. Fire hurts us, slows us, but it can't stop the inevitable. There are too many now. Dozens transforming across the island. By tomorrow night, hundreds. The ferry won't come in this weather. The seaplanes won't fly. Isle Royale is isolated, Robert. Perfect conditions for the hunger to spread. She took a step closer, and Robert fired his last flare. It went wide, missing Sarah completely, arcing over her shoulder into the forest behind her. But where it landed, it ignited something. One of the marked trees, bark stripped in that spiral pattern, wood saturated with some chemical the creatures produced. The tree exploded into flame despite the falling snow, fire spreading with impossible speed, jumping from marked tree to marked tree. The creatures screamed, all of them, dozens of voices raised in agony, harmony of suffering that made Robert's nose bleed, made his vision gray, made his knees buckle. Sarah fell, clawing at her head, antlers beginning to crack and splinter. Around her, the other transformed things writhed in the snow, bodies convulsing, transformations reversing in rapid, agonizing motion. Robert understood. The marked trees weren't warnings or territorial markers. They were part of the transformation infrastructure, nodes in a network that connected all the creatures shared their collective hunger. Burning the trees severed the connections, disrupted the pattern. He ran back toward the headquarters, toward the fire now consuming the building, grabbed a burning brand from the wreckage. The heat seared his frozen hands, but he held on, carried the flame into the forest. Every marked tree he touched exploded into fire. The pattern spread, jumping from tree to tree faster than he could track, flames racing through the network like neurons firing. The creature's screams intensified, sound becoming almost subsonic, vibrating through the ground. Robert fell to his knees in the snow, watching the forest burn, watching the impossible winter melt away as natural temperatures reasserted themselves. October returned in waves, 40 degrees, then 50, snow vanishing as if it had never existed. The creatures were changing. Their elongated bodies contracted, bones snapping back into human proportions, antlers crumbling to dust. He watched Sarah Blackwood's transformation reverse, watched her collapse into the slush, unconscious but breathing, human again. Around him, others were reverting too. Ashley Nguyen, James Hardwick, the unknown woman, the teenage boy, the middle-aged man. Dozens of people scattered through the burning forest, naked and shivering, confused and traumatized, but alive. Human. Robert forced himself to stand, to assess, to coordinate. Training reasserted itself through shock and exhaustion. He counted survivors. 37 visible from his position, probably more scattered through the forest. He checked Sarah first, found her pulse strong, breathing regular, body temperature dangerously low but rising. The headquarters was a total loss, but the maintenance sheet had survived. He dragged Sarah there first, wrapped her in emergency blankets, then went back for the others. One by one, he gathered the survivors, documented their conditions, prioritized treatment based on exposure severity. Ashley Nguyen was the worst. Her transformation had been the longest, the most complete. She remained unconscious for 6 hours, body temperature fluctuating wildly, vitals unstable. Robert stayed with her, monitoring constantly, administering what limited medical care he could manage. She woke at dawn, confused and terrified with no memory of the past week. Her last clear recollection was setting up camp at Siskiwit Lake, then nothing until waking in the maintenance shed. The same pattern repeated with the others. Memory loss covering the entire transformation period, confusion about how they'd arrived at their current locations, terror when they learned how much time had passed. The weather front broke 2 days later, allowing Robert to finally establish satellite communication. The Coast Guard arrived within hours, followed by medical helicopters, FBI agents, CDC investigators in biosafety suits. Robert gave his statement 17 times to 17 different agencies, showed them his documentation, his photographs, his thermal readings. Handed over Ashley's journal, James Hardwick's journal, Sarah's research notes, walked them through the burned sections of forest where marked trees had stood. None of it made sense, the investigators agreed. Mass psychogenic illness, they suggested. Contaminated water supply causing hallucinations and dissociative episodes. Some kind of chemical exposure, possibly from invasive algae species in Superior. They photographed everything, collected samples, interviewed survivors. Then they classified the incident, sealed the records, and issued a cover story about a severe weather event causing multiple cases of exposure and hypothermia. Isle Royale National Park closed for the remainder of the season. Indefinite closure, they said, pending environmental assessment. Robert was placed on administrative leave, required to undergo psychological evaluation. 3 months of sessions with a therapist who carefully avoided discussing the specifics of his traumatic experience, who focused instead on helping him process the stress of a challenging rescue operation. He passed the evaluation, returned to duty, was quietly transferred to Gateway National Recreation Area in New York, about as far from wilderness as the National Park Service could send him while keeping him employed. He never worked another backcountry posting. Sarah Blackwood left the Park Service entirely. Last Robert heard, she was teaching environmental science at a high school in Wisconsin, working with kids, staying as far from isolated forests as geography allowed. Ashley Nguyen spent 4 months in psychiatric care, was finally released with a diagnosis of dissociative fugue state triggered by extreme stress. She moved back to her family in California, stopped hiking, stopped going anywhere she couldn't see the city lights. The others scattered too. Survivors linked by trauma they couldn't remember and experiences the world insisted had never happened. Robert kept his notebooks. The official investigation had taken copies, but he'd maintained the originals. Every page of documentation from those 3 days in October 2011. He stored them in a fireproof safe in his apartment, took them out occasionally, read through his own observations, his carefully recorded facts and data. The thermal readings that showed temperatures below zero from living creatures. The photographs of marked trees radiating cold. The journal entries documenting transformation. Sarah's research on Wendigo mythology. His own notes describing creatures that violated every principle of biology and physics. Evidence that no one would ever believe. Sometimes, late at night, Robert would pull out his old topographic maps of Isle Royale. He'd trace the trails he'd walked, the locations where he'd found camps, the points where marked trees had clustered. The patterns formed geometry, mathematical relationships that he'd documented, but never fully analyzed during the crisis. The patterns looked like fractals, self-similar designs repeating at every scale, creating networks that could spread exponentially once established. He researched it obsessively, comparing his maps to models of neural networks, mycorrhizal fungal colonies, even quantum entanglement patterns. The marked trees had formed a distributed intelligence, he theorized, individual nodes in a collective consciousness that used human hosts to reproduce, to spread, to feed on something more fundamental than flesh. Fear, Ashley's journal had said. Fear has a taste. Maybe that was the hunger the creatures fed on. Not physical sustenance, but something psychological, emotional. The terror of transformation, the horror of losing humanity, the existential dread of becoming something other. Robert documented these theories in new notebooks, filled pages with equations and hypotheses, created models that might explain what had happened on that island. He sent them to no one, shared them with no one, kept them locked in his safe alongside the original evidence. Because the alternative, accepting that his experience had been hallucination, that the Wendigo weren't real, that everything he'd witnessed could be explained by contaminated water or mass hysteria, that alternative was somehow worse than accepting the existence of impossible creatures that fed on human transformation. At least the Wendigo followed rules, had patterns he could document, operated according to some internal logic, even if that logic violated conventional understanding. The alternative suggested his own mind was unreliable, that his powers of observation and deduction had failed him completely. Robert couldn't accept that. His rational framework, cracked and compromised as it was, remained the only thing preventing him from sliding into paranoia or madness. He kept working, kept documenting, kept maintaining his protocols. Different setting now, urban recreation area instead of wilderness, but the same fundamental approach. Observe, record, analyze, conclude. He never went back to Isle Royale, but he monitored it remotely, checking satellite imagery, reading reports from the skeleton crew the Park Service eventually stationed there, looking for patterns, for evidence of marked trees regrowing, for thermal anomalies in the data feeds. The park reopened in 2014, 3 years after the incident. Limited access, restricted permits, enhanced safety protocols. Robert read through the new regulations, noted what they didn't say, the careful language about environmental hazards and seasonal weather concerns. The Park Service knew something. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough to act on, but they knew enough to be cautious. Robert created an alert system, automated searches that monitored news reports, missing person cases, unexplained incidents in areas with documented Wendigo folklore, Algonquian territories, northern forests, isolated wilderness areas across Canada and the northern United States. The alerts triggered occasionally: a cluster of missing hikers in Quetico Provincial Park, unusual animal attacks in Pukasqua National Park, reports of winter that arrived too early in parts of the Superior National Forest. Robert documented each case, compared patterns, looked for correlations. He found them. Not definitive proof, but suggestions, hints that the hunger was still out there, still spreading, still transforming isolated victims in places remote enough that their disappearance wouldn't draw attention. He thought about going public, about publishing his findings, about warning people. But who would believe him? His own agency had classified the incident, sealed the records. The survivors had been interviewed, evaluated, and ultimately dismissed as victims of group delusion. His evidence, however meticulously documented, proved nothing except that Robert Fitzgerald had experienced something traumatic in October 2011. So he kept quiet, kept watching, kept documenting, and sometimes, on particularly cold nights, he would stand at his apartment window and wonder if the hunger he'd felt that day in the forest had ever truly left, if some part of it remained, buried deep, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. He'd check his reflection in the window glass, looking for signs of transformation, elongation in his features, unusual cold radiating from his skin, eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He never found anything, but the fear remained, constant companion, reminder of 3 days in October when his rational understanding of reality had shattered, and something ancient and terrible had proven itself undeniably real. Robert Fitzgerald kept his notebooks, maintained his documentation, lived his carefully ordered life, and he never stopped being hungry for answers that no amount of data could satisfy. The forest kept its secrets. The Wendigo remained, patient and persistent, waiting in the cold places, the isolated places, the places where hunger could transform into something older than humanity, waiting for the next winter, the next victim, the next transformation. Always hungry, always patient, always there. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The smell reached James Whitmore before anything else. Decay mixed with something chemical, artificial, wrong for these woods. Not the rich decomposition of fallen timber or the musk of animal kills, but something that made his throat close and his eyes water. He'd been a ranger at North Cascades National Park for 11 years, and in that time he'd smelled bear scat, rotting elk carcasses, even a hiker who'd been dead for 3 weeks in August heat. This was different. This was wrong in a way that bypassed his rational mind and went straight to something primitive, coiled at the base of his skull. James stood at the trailhead of the Cascade Pass Trail, elevation 3,600 feet, where the Douglas firs gave way to western hemlock, and the air should have carried nothing but pine resin and morning dew. The report had come in yesterday. Madison Garcia, 23, failed to return from a solo day hike. Her car, a blue Honda Civic with California plates, sat in the parking lot with her wallet still in the glove compartment. Standard stuff usually. Most missing hikers turned up within 48 hours, dehydrated and embarrassed, having taken a wrong turn and spent a night under the stars. But that smell. James pulled his Motorola radio from his belt, checked the battery, full charge, and clipped it back. His Garmin GPS showed his coordinates: 48, 4738 degree N, 121.0713 W. He'd start with the standard search pattern quarter-mile grid, working outward from the last known position. Madison's hiking permit said she'd planned to summit Sahale Peak and return by nightfall. That was 36 hours ago. He started up the trail, boots crunching on loose scree. The morning sun filtered through the canopy in weak shafts, but even that light seemed wrong. Too thin, too watery, like it was passing through something it shouldn't have to pass through. James had been seeing a therapist in Marble Mount for 2 years now, ever since the incident with the family from Portland. The Carsons. Mother, father, 2 kids. He'd found them 4 days after they'd gone missing, or what was left of them. The official report said exposure and animal predation. James's nightmares said something else, but he'd learned not to talk about what he saw in those nightmares. Dr. Reeves said he had PTSD. Said the hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts, the way he couldn't sleep without checking every window twice. All normal reactions to trauma. She didn't say what to do when those reactions started feeling less like symptoms and more like warnings. At mile marker 1.3, James found the first sign. A backpack, olive green north face, partially buried under a pile of loose stones someone had carefully arranged. Not fallen, not dropped, arranged. The pack's contents had been removed and laid out in a circle around it. Water bottle, granola bars, a fleece jacket, a dog-eared paperback of Desert Solitaire. In the center of the circle, a single hiking boot. Women's size 7, still laced. James's hand moved to his radio before he stopped himself. What would he say? That someone had made a stone cairn around a backpack? That wasn't protocol. Protocol was to document, photograph, mark the GPS coordinates, and continue searching. He pulled out his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot, one of the new models with 5 megapixels, and took 6 photos from different angles. The smell was stronger here, thick enough to taste. He bagged the boot as evidence, marked the location on his GPS, and continued up the trail. His heart hammered against his ribs in a rhythm that felt too fast, too insistent. The rational part of his brain, the part that had been trained at the National Park Service Academy, that knew search and rescue procedures by heart, cataloged the evidence. Subject possibly injured, proceeding on foot with only 1 boot, likely disoriented. The other part of his brain, the part that woke him at 3 a.m. with images of the Carson family's scattered remains, whispered something else entirely. The trail switchbacked through a stand of western red cedar, massive trunks that had been growing since before the park was established in 1968. James had always loved this section, the way the trees blocked out the sky and created a cathedral silence. Today, that silence felt like pressure against his eardrums, like being underwater. No birds. He realized it suddenly. He'd been hiking for 30 minutes and hadn't heard a single bird call. No Steller's jays, no nuthatches, no ravens. Nothing. At mile marker 2, he found the second boot. This one was placed carefully on top of a fallen log, laces tied together, tongue pulled out. Next to it, scratched into the soft wood of the log, were symbols he didn't recognize. Not graffiti. The cuts were too deliberate, too precise. They looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet James knew. He photographed them, tried to sketch them in his notebook, but his hand was shaking too badly to get the details right. His radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. "Whitmore, this is base. What's your 20? James keyed the mic. Mile marker 2 on Cascade Pass Trail. Found evidence. Subject's boots and backpack. No sign of subject yet. Static then. Copy that. Weather's moving in. Storm front expected by 1400 hours. How's visibility? James looked up at the canopy. Through the gaps, the sky had gone the color of old bruises. Deteriorating. I'm going to push to mile marker 3 before I turn back. Negative, Whitmore. New information. Sheriff's Department just called. They found Madison Garcia's credit card used at a gas station in Concrete this morning, 7 a.m. James felt something cold slide down his spine. That's impossible. Her wallet's in her car. That's what they said, but the security footage shows a woman matching her description. Pumped $20 of regular, paid cash, and left. But her car, still in the lot. We're thinking maybe she had a spare card or someone's using stolen ID. Either way, this might not be a missing person anymore. Might be something else. Come back to base. We need to reassess. James looked up the trail. The smell was even stronger now, a physical presence that seemed to press against his face. Copy. Heading back. He signed off, but didn't move. Something was wrong with the timeline. Wrong with the story. Madison Garcia had been missing for 36 hours. Her credit card had been used 7 hours ago in Concrete, 30 miles away. But her boots were here, arranged like offerings. Her backpack was here, contents displayed in a circle. And that smell, that god-awful smell that made his lizard brain scream run, 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 was getting stronger the higher he went on the trail. James Whitmore had spent 2 years learning to ignore his instincts, to trust the rational explanations Dr. Reeves gave him for the fear that never quite left. But standing on that trail with the smell of wrongness thick in his throat and symbols he couldn't read carved into dead wood, those instincts were screaming so loud he couldn't think. He started hiking, not down, up. The trail narrowed as it climbed, switchbacking through subalpine meadow where avalanche lilies should have been blooming but weren't. The vegetation itself looked wrong. Ferns curled brown at the edges, moss hanging from the trees in gray sheets like funeral shrouds. James's breathing came harder, partly from the elevation gain, partly from something else. That feeling of being watched he'd first noticed at the Carson site, the sensation of eyes in the darkness just beyond the flashlight beam. It was here, stronger than it had been in 2 years of therapy and medication and trying to convince himself that trauma played tricks on the mind. At mile marker 3, the trail opened onto a small clearing. James stopped so suddenly he nearly fell. In the center of the clearing was a structure made of branches and stones, something between a cairn and a lean-to, maybe 4 feet high. Inside it, folded with the precision of a military funeral, was Madison Garcia's red fleece jacket, and on top of the jacket, arranged in a pattern that made James's vision swim when he looked at it directly, were fingernails. Human fingernails, 20 of them, torn out by the roots, still trailing bits of flesh. James's camera fell from his hands. The sound of it hitting the ground seemed impossibly loud, like a gunshot in a library. He bent to pick it up, and that's when he saw the tracks. Not boot prints, not animal prints, something else. Long, elongated like human feet, but wrong, stretched, the toe impressions too long and too many. They circled the clearing, and James counted the stride length. 7 feet. Whatever made these tracks had been moving fast, loping like a wolf but on 2 legs. The Carsons had tracks like these around their campsite. James had photographed them, included them in his report. The official explanation had been a bear, standing on hind legs. But James had seen what was left of the Carsons, and no bear did that kind of damage. No bear arranged the remains the way they'd been arranged, sorted by type, bones in one pile, clothes in another, and the soft tissues nowhere to be found, as if something had been hungry enough to eat everything down to the organs and the fat and the muscle. His radio crackled again. Whitmore, acknowledge. He didn't respond. Couldn't, because beyond the clearing where the trail disappeared into a thick stand of mountain hemlock, something was standing. Not walking, not moving, just standing. Tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette wrong in ways James's eyes kept trying to correct but couldn't. It was the color of exposed bone, or maybe it was bone, he couldn't tell from here. Antlers? No, not antlers. Something that looked like antlers but branched in geometries that hurt to see, rose from its head, and even from 50 yards away, James could smell it. That chemical decay, that wrongness that had been getting stronger with every step he took up the trail. The thing tilted its head, and James heard a sound like breaking ice, like snapping branches, like his own teeth chattering in February cold. It took a step toward him. Another, moving with the jerky, disjointed gait of a marionette with half its strings cut. James ran. He didn't remember the decision to run, didn't remember turning around. 1 second he was staring at the thing, the next he was crashing down the trail, boots sliding on loose scree, arms windmilling for balance. Behind him, that sound. Crack, 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 like someone walking on frozen pond ice. The warning before everything gives way. He didn't look back. Looking back at the Carson site had given him 2 years of nightmares. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. The trail blurred past. James's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't slow down until he reached his truck at the trailhead. His hands shook so badly he dropped his keys twice before getting the door open. He climbed in, locked the doors. Useless, he knew it was useless, but he did it anyway, and grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Whitmore, I need..." His voice cracked. He swallowed, tried again. "I need immediate backup at Cascade Pass trailhead. Possible." What? Possible what? Possible dangerous wildlife encounter requesting armed response. The radio was silent for a long moment. Then, Whitmore. What kind of wildlife? James looked up at the trail. The thing was there, standing at the edge of the tree line. Too tall, too thin, its antlered head cocked at an angle that would break a human neck. Watching him. It raised one arm, too long, too many joints, and beckoned. "I don't know," James said into the radio. "I don't know what it is." "Whitmore, are you injured? Do you need medical?" The thing took a step forward into the sunlight. James got his first clear look at it and wished he hadn't. Its skin wasn't bone white, it was transparent, stretched so tight over the skeleton beneath that he could see every ridge of vertebrae, every curve of rib. Its face was human, or had been human once, before something twisted it into a mask of permanent hunger. The eyes were the worst part. Yellow-white with cataracts, but aware, intelligent, looking at him with recognition that made his bladder clench. It smiled, lips pulling back from teeth filed to points, blackened gums. And in that smile, James saw Madison Garcia, saw the Carsons, saw every missing hiker the park had lost in the past 20 years. "Whitmore, acknowledge." He tore his eyes away from the thing and started his truck. The engine turned over on the first try, small miracle, and he threw it into reverse. Gravel sprayed as he backed out of the parking space, yanked the wheel around, shifted into drive. In the rearview mirror, the thing stood watching, not following. Not yet. James drove down the access road doing 50 on curves posted for 25, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. His radio kept crackling with demands for status updates, but he couldn't make himself answer. What would he say? That the thing from his nightmares, the thing he'd convinced himself was just trauma and PTSD and his mind's way of coping with terrible things, was real? That it was standing at the Cascade Pass trailhead, wearing Madison Garcia's skin like a suit? By the time he reached the ranger station in Marble Mount, the sun was high and the sky had cleared. The Stormfront base had warned about never materialized. James pulled into his parking spot, turned off the engine, and sat there, breathing. His hands had stopped shaking. His heart rate had returned to something approaching normal. In the daylight, in the parking lot of a government building with American flags and Forest Service logos, what he'd seen on the trail seemed impossible, ridiculous. The kind of thing Dr. Reeves would gently suggest might be a flashback, a panic attack. His traumatized brain protecting itself by creating external threats he could run from. But his boots were covered in mud from the trail. His camera, he checked, still had photos of the backpack, the boot, the symbols carved in wood. Evidence. Except when he scrolled through the images, his breath caught. In the photos of the clearing, in the background behind the structure of branches and stones, there was a figure. Tall, thin, antlered, looking directly at the camera. He deleted the photos, all of them, then went inside. The station was quiet. Just Linda Chen at the dispatch desk and Tom Reeves, no relation to his therapist, reviewing maps in the conference room. Linda looked up as James entered. "Jesus, Whitmore, you look like hell. What happened up there?" James opened his mouth, closed it. "Nothing. False alarm. Probably just saw elk through the trees, got spooked." Linda's eyebrows rose. "You called for armed backup because of an elk?" "Like I said, spooked. I'm going to write up my report." He didn't write up a report. Instead, he sat at his desk and opened the file on Madison Garcia. 23, from Sacramento, graduate student studying environmental science at Berkeley. Passionate hiker, experienced in wilderness survival, had submitted a detailed itinerary of her planned route. No history of mental illness, no financial problems, no reason to vanish. The credit card used that morning was the last activity on any of her accounts. James pulled up another file. The Carsons, Richard, 38, Jennifer, 35, Emma, 7, Caleb, 5. Reported missing June 2005, found 4 days later at an illegal campsite 3 miles off trail in the Stehekin Valley. Official cause of death, exposure and animal predation. But James remembered. He remembered the way the bones had been arranged in a spiral pattern, the way all the soft tissue was gone, the way the campfire had been burning with a heat that melted the stones in the fire ring. And he remembered the tracks, those impossible 7-foot stride tracks that circled the camp like something had been dancing. He opened a third file, this one pulled from the archives. 1997. Hikers named David and Susan Miller, both 24, found dead near Hidden Lake. 1992. A family of 4, the Johnsons, last seen on the Thunder Creek Trail. 1989. 3 college students from Oregon vanished from a permitted campsite at Copper Ridge. All of them found eventually, or what was left of them. All of them with the same inconsistencies in the reports: missing soft tissue, unexplained symbols at the scene, tracks that didn't match any known animal, and all of them in years when the winter had been particularly harsh, when the snowpack was heavy and the spring melt came late, and the park's deer and elk populations had been thin. James pulled out his personal laptop. He didn't want this search in the Forest Service system, and opened a browser. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, wasn't sure he wanted to find it, but he typed anyway. Native American Legends, North Cascades, Cannibalism. The results made his stomach turn. Story after story from the Skagit and Nlaka'pamux tribes. Warnings about the Stick Indians, the Forest Walkers. The things that looked like men but weren't. That had once been men but weren't anymore. And one name kept appearing, transliterated different ways but always recognizable. Wendigo. Widigo. Windigo. The hunger spirit. The Algonquian tribes had the most detailed accounts, but variations existed across dozens of indigenous cultures, particularly in the northern forests, where winter meant survival was measured in calories, and sometimes the only calories left were each other. The legends were consistent in their details. When a person resorted to cannibalism, they became something else. The first taste of human flesh triggered a transformation, a spiritual corruption that twisted body and mind. The more they ate, the taller they grew, the thinner they stretched, until they were nothing but walking hunger wrapped in translucent skin. They could never be sated. Every meal made them hungrier, and they always returned to the places they'd first fed, drawn back by memory or instinct or the need to relive that first terrible transgression. James found an academic paper from the University of Washington's Anthropology Department, published in 1998, Wendigo Psychosis and Frontier Cannibalism, Cultural Interpretation of Taboo Violation in Pacific Northwest Tribes. The author, Dr. Sarah Blackwell, had spent 10 years collecting oral histories from elders in the Cascade region. She'd documented 47 distinct accounts of Wendigo encounters spanning from the 1850s to the 1970s. Most of them followed a pattern: harsh winter, isolated trappers or hunters, desperation, the first taste, and then the transformation. The survivors, those few who'd encountered a Wendigo and lived, all reported the same details: the incredible height, the antlers made of bone-white cartilage, the transparent skin, the smell, like spoiled meat and chemical preservatives, and the eyes, always the eyes, human enough to show intelligence but alien enough to confirm that whatever looked out from behind them wasn't human anymore. Dr. Blackwell's paper concluded with a clinical discussion of Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome where individuals became obsessed with the fear of becoming cannibals. Western psychiatry dismissed it as a manifestation of schizophrenia or anxiety disorders. But Blackwell, in her final paragraph, noted something curious. In every case where someone had been diagnosed with Wendigo psychosis and subsequently acted on those compulsions, the person had vanished into the wilderness. No bodies were ever recovered. No arrests were ever made. They simply disappeared, as if the forest itself had swallowed them. James closed his laptop and stared at the wall. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the peaks of the North Cascades in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful. Deadly. He'd spent 11 years in these mountains, thought he knew every trail, every peak, every hidden valley. But he'd been wrong. There were older things in these forests than the Douglas firs, older than the glaciers, older than the mountains themselves. Things that remembered when this land was just ice and wind, and the desperate hunger of animals trying to survive one more winter. His phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again, and Linda's voice came through the intercom. "Whitmore, Sheriff Morrison on line 2, says it's urgent." James picked up. "Whitmore." "James, it's Tom Morrison, the Skagit County Sheriff, a good man who'd helped with the Carson investigation. I need you to sit down for this." "I'm sitting." "We found Madison Garcia, or we think we did. Concrete PD got a call about a woman acting erratically at the Gas and Go on Highway 20. When officers arrived, she was eating. James, she was eating a raccoon. Raw. She'd caught it in the dumpster and just..." He trailed off. "They tried to restrain her and she fought. Bit one officer, broke another one's wrist. Took 3 of them to get her in cuffs. They're transporting her to Cascade Valley Hospital now, but James, she's not right. The things she's saying, the way she's moving, it's like she's pretending to be human but doesn't quite remember how." James's mouth had gone dry. "What's she saying?" "She keeps asking if we're hungry. Over and over. 'Are you hungry? I'm so hungry. When will we eat?' And her teeth, James. Her teeth look filed. They're going to do a psych eval, but I wanted to call you first because of the missing person report. Can you come down to the hospital? We need someone who knows her file. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Linda called after him. "Whitmore, what's going on?" "Following up on the Garcia case. I'll be back late." He drove to Concrete on autopilot, hands steady on the wheel, mind racing. Madison Garcia was alive. She'd been missing for 36 hours, and now she was alive and eating roadkill and asking if people were hungry. James tried to imagine what could have happened to her on that trail, tried to construct a rational narrative. Maybe she'd fallen, hit her head, developed some kind of brain injury that caused behavioral changes. Maybe she'd taken drugs, had a psychotic break. Maybe she'd been attacked by a person, some crazy hermit living off-grid in the park who'd done something to her, traumatized her into this state. Except none of those explanations accounted for the backpack arranged in a circle, the boots placed like offerings, the fingernails torn out by the roots, the symbols carved in wood, or the thing James had seen at the trailhead, the tall, thin thing with transparent skin and antlers and Madison Garcia's face. Cascade Valley Hospital was a small facility serving the upper Skagit Valley, maybe 40 beds total. James pulled into the parking lot and found Sheriff Morrison waiting outside the ER entrance, smoking despite the no smoking signs posted every 10 feet. "James." Morrison ground out his cigarette. Thanks for coming. Fair warning, this is bad. I've been a cop for 28 years and I've never seen anything like this. They entered through the ER and were directed to the secure psychiatric wing. 2 concrete PD officers stood outside a room with a small window in the door. Both looked shaken. One had a bandage wrapped around his forearm, blood seeping through. "She bite you?" Morrison asked. The officer nodded. "Took a chunk out. I've had all my shots, but they're giving me a rabies series anyway. Sheriff, whatever's wrong with her, it's not drugs. I've collared tweakers, PCP freaks, bath salts, psychos. This is different." James approached the window and looked through. The room was bare except for a hospital bed bolted to the floor. Madison Garcia sat on the bed, wearing a hospital gown, wrists restrained with padded cuffs. She looked smaller than her driver's license photo, gaunt like she'd lost 20 pounds in 36 hours. Her hair hung in greasy tangles and her skin had a grayish cast. But it was her eyes that made James's breath catch. They were filmy, cataract white, but the pupils were visible beneath like shadows under ice. She sensed him looking and turned her head with that same jerky, marionette motion the thing on the trail had used. Then she smiled, lips pulling back from teeth that were definitely pointed, definitely filed. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, damaged, like someone who'd been screaming for hours. "Ranger, I know you. I saw you on the trail. Did you like my gifts?" James forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Madison, can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" She giggled, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "Madison's so hungry. She's always hungry now. The first taste is best, but then you need more and more and more, and it's never enough. The hunger doesn't stop. It gets bigger. You get bigger. You get so tall you can touch the sky, but the hunger gets taller, and you can never catch up. Madison, what happened to you on the trail?" "The trail." She cocked her head and James heard her neck crack. "There was no trail. There was just the winter and the cold, and the knowing that I would die if I didn't eat. And then I found them, the others, already dead, already frozen, and I thought it was okay because they were already dead. They didn't need their meat anymore. But meat tastes different when it's human meat. Tastes like coming home. Tastes like every meal you've ever wanted. Tastes like purpose." Morrison was at James's elbow. "She's been talking like this since we picked her up. Doctors can't figure out what's wrong with her. Blood work is normal except for severe malnutrition and dehydration. No drugs in her system. No signs of head trauma. But her behavior, her speech patterns, the way she moves, it's like she's imitating being human based on a description." James couldn't look away from those filmy eyes. "You need to keep her restrained. Don't let her out of that room and don't let her bite anyone else." "What do you think is wrong with her?" James finally turned to look at Morrison. The sheriff was in his 50s, weathered face, crow's feet from squinting into the sun. A practical man who dealt in evidence and procedure. How could James explain what he'd seen on the trail? How could he talk about wendigos and hunger spirits and the terrible price of cannibalism without sounding insane? "I think she ate something she shouldn't have," James said carefully. "And I think it changed her." "You mean like mushrooms? Toxic plants?" "Something like that." Behind them, Madison started laughing. It built slowly, then crescendoed into a shriek that made both officers jump back from the door. She threw herself against the restraints, hospital bed scraping across the floor despite being bolted down. Her back arched, and James heard something crack, vertebrae separating, stretching, her arms elongated, fingers extending, skin pulling tight and translucent. The hospital gown split as her body grew taller, thinner, bones jutting through skin like tent poles through canvas. Jesus Christ. Morrison fumbled for his radio. "I need backup in psych now. Patient is..." Madison's restraint snapped, leather and steel popping like thread. She slid off the bed, unfolding to her new height, 7 feet, 8, 9, head scraping the ceiling tiles. Her mouth opened wider than should have been possible, jaw unhinging like a snake's, and that smell rolled out, thick and choking. Decay, chemicals. Wrong. "Run," James said, then louder, grabbing Morrison's arm. "Run!" They ran. The two officers were already gone, pounding down the hallway toward the main hospital. Behind them, the door to Madison's room exploded outward, frame splintering, drywall crumbling. James risked a glance back and saw her, emerge into the hallway. Too tall for the ceiling, it hunched, antlers scraping the acoustic tiles. Those cataract eyes fixed on James, and it smiled with Madison Garcia's face stretched over a skull that wasn't human anymore. "So hungry," it whispered, and its voice carried down the hallway like wind through a tunnel. "You smell warm. You smell like meat that's still moving. That's the best kind." James and Morrison hit the security door to the main hospital at full speed, slammed through, spun to pull it shut behind them. The magnetic lock clicked, heavy-duty steel designed to contain violent patients. Through the window, James watched the thing that had been Madison Garcia approach the door. It placed one elongated hand against the glass, fingers splayed and pressed. The glass cracked, fractured, but held. It tilted its head, studying them like a curious child. Then it turned and loped back down the hallway and that disjointed gate, toward the other exit, toward the officers who'd run that direction. "Call everybody," James told Morrison. "State police, Fish and Wildlife, National Guard if you can get them. Lock down the hospital. Don't let anyone in or out. And whatever you do, don't try to capture it. You can't, you can only run." "What the hell is that thing?" "It's what happens when we forget why some taboos exist." James didn't wait for Morrison to respond. He pushed through the main hospital doors and sprinted to his truck. His hands shook as he started the engine, but his mind was clear, crystalline with purpose. He knew what he had to do. The thing that wore Madison Garcia's skin was loose in concrete, and by morning there would be more victims, more transformations. The hunger was contagious. The first taste led to the second, and the second to the third, and soon there would be a pack of them, hunting through the North Cascades, driven by an appetite that could never be satisfied. James drove north on Highway 20, back toward the park. He didn't go to the ranger station. Instead, he took the service road to his cabin, a small A-frame he rented on private land adjacent to the park boundary. Inside, he pulled down the boxes he'd stored in the back of his closet 2 years ago, after the Carson investigation. The boxes he'd told Dr. Reeves he'd thrown away. Research, printouts, photos he'd taken of symbols at the Carson site and then been ordered to delete, books on indigenous legends and folklore he'd bought from used bookstores in Seattle. And buried at the bottom, wrapped in canvas, a bundle of sage and sweetgrass he'd purchased from a Skagit elder who'd asked him why he needed it. And then, when James explained what he'd seen, told him how to use it. "The hunger spirit can't be killed," the elder had said. "Once the transformation is complete, the body is just a shell. But fire purifies, sage cleanses. And if you burn the shell completely, scatter the ashes in running water, the spirit can't find a new host. It goes back to the cold places, the hungry places, and waits for the next foolish person to violate the taboo." James had thought the man was humoring him, speaking in metaphors about a purely psychological phenomenon. Now he understood the elder had been utterly, terrifyingly literal. He loaded his truck, the sage bundle, a 5-gallon can of gasoline, road flares, a fire extinguisher for afterward. Then he added his Remington 870 shotgun, not because it would kill the thing, but because it might slow it down long enough to do what needed to be done. He was loading extra shells when his cell phone rang. Morrison. "James, where are you?" "Following a lead. What's the situation?" "Bad. The Garcia woman, thing, whatever, killed 2 officers. Ate them, James. Right there in the hospital parking lot. We've got roadblocks on Highway 20. Choppers in the air, but it's heading into the forest. Moving fast. Faster than anything human should move. Let it go." "What?" "Let it go into the forest. It's heading to the place it was made, the place it first fed. I know where that is. I'm going to end this." "James, listen to yourself. You need to stand down. This is a law enforcement situation now. We'll handle it." "You can't handle it. Your bullets won't stop it. Your tasers won't slow it. It's not an animal, Tom. It's not even really alive anymore. It's hunger wearing a human shape, and the only way to stop it is to burn it completely and scatter the ashes. Now I'm going to do that, and you're going to keep your people away from the Cascade Pass trailhead for the next 12 hours. Can you do that? Silence on the line, then. The Carson family. You saw something up there, didn't you? Something you didn't put in the report. Yeah, I saw something. And I've been running from it for 2 years. I'm done running. James. He hung up. Then he turned off the phone, removed the battery, and threw it in the cabin sink. Whatever happened tonight, he couldn't have Morrison trying to talk him out of it or sending backup that would just become more victims. The drive to Cascade Pass took 45 minutes. The sun was down, the sky full of stars, the kind of clear mountain night that brought tourists from all over the world to see the Milky Way undimmed by city lights. James parked at the trailhead. Madison Garcia's Honda was still there, undisturbed, and loaded his pack. Shotgun slung over his shoulder, gasoline can in one hand, sage bundle in the other. He looked like a man preparing for war. He supposed he was. The smell hit him at the trailhead stronger than this morning, thick enough to choke on. The thing was here, or nearby, drawn back to this place by whatever instinct governed such creatures. James clicked on his flashlight, a heavy maglite that doubled as a club, and started up the trail. The forest at night was a different world. His flashlight beam picked out details in stark relief. The pale bark of aspens, the gleam of eyes in the underbrush that might have been a raccoon or might have been something else. The trail was empty of other hikers, thank God. But James could hear movement in the trees, the crack of branches, the scrape of something large passing through dense foliage. At mile marker 1.3, where he'd found the backpack that morning, James stopped. The carefully arranged circle of Madison's belongings was gone. In its place was something new, a spiral of bones, fresh ones, still gleaming with moisture. Human radius and ulna, he recognized from his EMT training, the 2 officers from the hospital. The thing had brought them here, to this place, and arranged their remains like an artist signing a canvas. James swallowed bile and kept moving. The smell grew stronger with each step, and under it he detected something else. Smoke. Wood smoke, but wrong. Chemical sharp like burning plastic. At mile marker 2, he found the source. The fallen log where he'd seen the symbols carved this morning was on fire, burning with a blue-white flame that gave off no heat. The symbols glowed in the wood, pulsing like a heartbeat, and James understood with sudden clarity that they weren't random scratches. They were a language, a message, an invitation. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 5 steps. James's breath fogged in front of him, and frost formed on the ferns at the trail's edge. Wrong. It was late September, still warm enough for shorts and t-shirts at this elevation. This cold was coming from somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't bound by seasons or weather patterns. He reached the clearing at mile marker 3 as midnight approached. He checked his watch compulsively, aware that there was significance to the timing even if he didn't understand what it was. The structure of branches and stones was still there, but it had been rebuilt, made larger, more elaborate. It stood 8 feet tall now, a grotesque parody of a shrine, and around its base were arranged more bones, dozens of them, hundreds, some old enough to be brown with age, others fresh enough to still have tissue clinging to them. The thing stepped out from behind the structure. In the moonlight, it was even more horrible than it had been in daylight. Madison Garcia's face was completely gone now, absorbed into the elongated skull, and what remained was a mask of stretched skin over jutting bones. The antlers had grown, branching up and out like a dead tree, and from them hung strips of cloth, pieces of clothing from its victims, James realized. Trophies. It regarded him with those filmy eyes, head cocked at that unnatural angle. When it spoke, its voice was layered, multiple tones at once. Madison's hoarse whisper underneath something deeper, older, that resonated in James's chest like a bass note. Ranger, you came back. I knew you would. The hungry always return to the place where they first learned to fear. James unslung the shotgun, pumped a shell into the chamber. "I'm not here to talk." "No?" It took a step closer, and James saw that its feet left those elongated prints in the soft earth, 7-foot strides. Then why come at all? Why not stay in your safe building with your safe people and pretend you didn't see? That's what you did before, after the family. You saw what I did to them, and you ran. You let me stay here hunting, feeding, and you ran. The words hit like physical blows. James's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The Carsons. That was you? Not me. Another. We're drawn to the same places, we hungry ones. Where the taboo was first broken, where the first taste was taken. This forest has known us for centuries. Long before your park, before your trails and permits and regulations. The Skagit people knew. They had rules. Don't hunt alone in winter. Don't camp where the bones are. Don't eat the meat that tastes too sweet. But your people forgot. You always forget. It moved closer, and James raised the shotgun. That's far enough. Or what? You'll shoot? I've been shot before. I've been stabbed, burned with ordinary fire, beaten with clubs and stones. The shell survives everything except the sacred fire, and you don't have sacred fire. You have gasoline and road flares. Crude. Ineffective. But it stopped moving, James noted. For all its confidence, it had stopped. Madison Garcia, James said, trying to find some remnant of the woman in the thing before him. If you're still in there, fight it. You can still. Madison is gone. She's been eaten. I ate her from the inside, memory by memory, thought by thought, until nothing remained but the hunger. That's what we do. That's what we are. The hunger that walks, the famine that hunts. And you, Ranger, you've been hungry too, haven't you? Not for food, for answers, for revenge against whatever killed those children you found. I can smell it on you. That gnawing emptiness that never quite fills. James's hand trembled. The thing was right, in a way that made him sick. Since the Carsons, he'd been empty, going through the motions of living but never quite present, always looking over his shoulder for the thing that had killed them, looking for answers in files and research and indigenous legends, because confronting the truth, that some things couldn't be explained or fixed or arrested, was too terrible to accept. "I'm nothing like you," he said. "No? Then why are you here alone? Why didn't you bring help? Why do you have a gun you know won't work and fire you know won't burn hot enough?" It smiled, those filed teeth catching the moonlight. "Because part of you wants to feed too. Part of you wants to become what I am. No more fear. No more doubt. Just the clarity of hunger and the satisfaction of the hunt. You're wrong. Am I?" It took another step, close enough now that James could see the individual bones beneath its transparent skin, the way its heart, black and withered, still beat in its chest. "Pull the trigger then. Shoot me. Burn me. Try to stop me. But know that every person who fights us, every person who comes close enough to look into our eyes, carries a seed of us away. The hunger is contagious. The fear is fertile ground. And one day when winter comes and you're alone and desperate, you'll remember how I looked at you tonight. You'll remember that there's always a choice. Starve or feed. Die or become." James fired. The shotgun blast caught the thing in the chest, knocked it backward, the sound echoing off the mountain peaks like thunder. The thing stumbled, looked down at the spreading hole in its torso. Then it looked up at James and laughed. "See? Just a shell. Just meat and bone. You can't kill what's already dead." But James was already moving. He dropped the shotgun, grabbed the gasoline can, and ran forward. The thing was still laughing when he emptied 5 gallons of fuel over its body, soaking the translucent skin, the grotesque antlers, the shrine of bones behind it. It stopped laughing when James pulled out the sage bundle, the sweetgrass braid, and the small leather pouch the Skagit elder had given him. "Wait." James struck a road flare. The hiss and spark of phosphorus igniting, the red light painting the clearing like hell's own torch. He touched the flame to the sage bundle, began speaking the words the elder had taught him. Not English, not Spanish. Something older, something that predated both languages, words that had been spoken in these mountains when the glaciers still covered the peaks, and the only humans were those who knew the dangers of the long winter. "You said I didn't have sacred fire," James said. "You were wrong." He threw the burning sage at the thing's feet. The gasoline caught instantly, a wall of flame that roared up 15 feet, and this time the fire was different. Not blue-white and cold, but orange-red and scorching. The thing shrieked, a sound that made James's ears ring, and tried to run. But the flames spread faster, consuming the translucent skin, cracking the bones, melting the antlers into puddles of blackened calcium. "It burns!" The thing's voice was changing, becoming higher, younger, Madison Garcia's voice without the deeper undertones. "Please, it burns. Make it stop. I'm so hungry, please." James backed away, shielding his face from the heat. The thing collapsed, writhing, the shrine of bones behind it catching fire too. Years of trophies and remains turning to ash. The smell was indescribable, burning meat and hair and something else. Something chemical and old that made James's eyes water and his stomach heave. It took 20 minutes to burn completely. James stood watch the entire time, adding the remaining road flares when the flames began to die down, making sure nothing remained but ash and charred bone fragments. When it was done, when the fire had burned itself out and nothing remained but a blackened circle on the ground, James pulled out a collapsible shovel from his pack and began gathering the ashes. The elder had been specific. Scatter them in running water far from where the transformation occurred. Don't bury them. Don't leave them. Water will carry them away, dilute them, make sure the spirit can't coalesce again. James worked methodically, scooping ash and bone fragments into a heavy-duty garbage bag, making sure he got every piece. His hands were shaking again, but this time from exhaustion rather than fear. When the clearing was empty, just a burned patch of earth and the faint smell of gasoline and sage, James hiked back down the trail. The sun was rising by the time he reached his truck, painting the peaks in shades of gold and pink. Beautiful. He drove to the Cascade River, found a place where the water ran fast and deep over smooth stones and scattered the ashes. They spread across the surface, swirling in eddies, then sinking into the current. Gone. James sat on the riverbank and watched the sun come up. His phone, he'd retrieved it from the cabin, buzzed with 17 missed calls from Morrison, 6 from the ranger station, and 1 from Dr. Reeves, who probably wondered why he'd missed their Thursday appointment. He didn't answer any of them. Not yet. First, he needed to sit here in the morning light and remember what it felt like to be human, to be tired and scared and alive. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Whitmore." "Jesus, James, where have you been? We've been looking for you all night." Morrison, sounding exhausted. "The Garcia woman thing, we found it. Or what was left of it. Pile of ash in a clearing up on Cascade Pass. Something burned it so hot there's nothing left but carbon scoring on the rocks. You know anything about that?" "No," James lied. "I was following another lead. Turned out to be nothing." "Yeah, well, whatever happened, it's over. County's declaring it a gas explosion, probably from one of those illegal meth labs. Simpler than trying to explain what was on the hospital security footage. As far as the official record goes, Madison Garcia died of misadventure in the wilderness. Body recovered and cremated due to biohazard concerns. The 2 officers killed were victims of an animal attack. Black bear, probably. And you and I never had this conversation. Sounds good to me. James, I read your file, the Carson case. You were right. About the tracks, the arrangement of the remains, all of it. I'm sorry we didn't listen." James closed his eyes. "It's okay. Some things people aren't ready to hear." "Will there be more? More of those things?" "Only if someone's desperate enough and hungry enough and alone enough to make the choice Madison Garcia made. Could be next week. Could be never. Best we can do is remember why the taboos exist, and maybe listen when the indigenous folks tell us there are places we shouldn't go, times we shouldn't hunt, things we shouldn't eat. That's asking a lot of people." "Yeah," James said. "It is." He hung up, pocketed the phone, and sat watching the water. The Cascade River ran clear and cold, snowmelt from the peaks, and somewhere in it were the ashes of a thing that had once been a graduate student from Berkeley, with a passion for environmental science and no idea that the old stories were true. James thought about Madison Garcia, about the moment she must have made the choice to eat human flesh, probably not even understanding what she was doing until it was too late. He thought about the hunger that drove her, the transformation that followed, the terrible clarity of purpose that replaced everything human about her. And he thought about the thing's words. The hunger is contagious. The fear is fertile ground. James stood, brushed ash from his hands, and walked back to his truck. He'd go home, sleep for a day, then write up his report. Misadventure. Body recovered. Case closed. And if in the future, during the long winters when the snowpack was heavy and the springs came late, if he heard reports of hikers gone missing in impossible ways, remains found in arrangements that didn't make sense, well, he'd know what to do. He'd know about the sacred fire, and the sage, and the running water. He'd know to look for the signs, the elongated tracks, the chemical smell, the cold that wasn't natural. Most importantly, he'd remember what the Skagit elder told him, the last thing the man said before James left with his bundle of sage and sweetgrass. The hunger spirit isn't evil. Evil requires choice, intention. The Wendigo is simply hunger made manifest, the natural consequence of breaking the oldest taboo. We created them in a way. Every culture that faced starvation and made the choice to eat its own dead created them. They're our shadow, Ranger, the dark reflection of our will to survive, and they'll exist as long as we exist because the hunger never truly dies. It just waits. James drove back to Marble Mount as the morning traffic started filling Highway 20. Logging trucks heading to the mills, tourist cars heading to the trails, families starting their day with coffee and optimism, and no idea that something terrible had almost been born in their mountains. He envied them that innocence, but he also knew he couldn't have it anymore. Not after what he'd seen, what he'd done. The ranger station was busy when he arrived, Linda at the dispatch desk handling the morning's calls, Tom Reeves reviewing maintenance schedules. They looked up when James entered, and Linda's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Whitmore, you look like death warmed over. Morrison said you were following up on the Garcia case?" "Yeah, it's closed now. Body recovered." "Jesus, that poor girl. Her parents called this morning wanting to know when they could claim her remains. What do I tell them?" James thought about Madison Garcia's elongated form, the filed teeth, the hunger that consumed her from the inside. What could you tell parents about a death like that? How could you explain that their daughter had become something else? Something that wore her face like a mask until even that was burned away. "Tell them she's at peace," James said, "and that the mountains took her quickly. No suffering. It was a lie, but a kinder one than the truth." Linda nodded, made a note, turned back to her computer. Tom Reeves caught James's eye and gestured toward the break room. James followed, and Tom closed the door behind them. "Morrison called me," Tom said quietly. "Told me about the hospital, about what Garcia had become. He didn't use the word, but I know what he meant. My grandfather was in Lakapamuks. He told me stories about the hunger spirits when I was a kid. I thought they were just cautionary tales, you know? Don't wander off alone in winter, don't eat strange meat, but they were real, weren't they?" "Yeah," James said. "They were real. Are there more? I don't know. Maybe. The forest is old, Tom. Older than the park, older than the logging industry, older than the European settlements. And people have been starving in these mountains for thousands of years. Every time someone made that choice, every time the hunger got too strong and the taboo too weak," he shrugged. "Let's just say Madison Garcia probably wasn't the first, and she might not be the last." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer in the break room cabinet and pulled out a small leather pouch, similar to the one the Skagit elder had given James. "My grandfather gave me this before he died. Said it was protection. Sage and sweetgrass and something else, I never asked what. He told me that if I ever saw signs, tracks that weren't quite right, bones arranged in patterns, cold that came from nowhere, I should burn this and speak the old words. I thought he was being superstitious, but now... Keep it, James said, and teach someone else the words, just in case. You think it'll happen again? I think people get desperate. I think winters get hard. And I think the hunger never really dies. James grabbed his mug from the cabinet, poured coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, took a sip that burned his tongue. But we can be ready. We can remember. That's all we can do. Tom nodded slowly, slipped the pouch back into the drawer. You going to be okay after what you saw? James considered the question. Was he okay? He'd spent 2 years trying to convince himself that the Carson incident was trauma, hallucination, his mind's way of coping with horror. Now he knew the truth, and that truth was somehow worse and better simultaneously. Worse because it confirmed that the world contained things more terrible than he'd imagined. Better because he could finally stop questioning his sanity, stop wondering if he'd invented the threat to avoid accepting that sometimes bad things just happened. I will be, James said. Eventually. He spent the rest of the day at his desk writing reports that didn't mention Wendigos or transformations or sacred fire. Madison Garcia died of misadventure, body recovered, family notified. The 2 officers killed in animal attack, deaths being investigated by Skagit County Sheriff's Department. Clean, simple. Wrong in every way that mattered, but right in the sense that sometimes people needed the comfortable lie more than the terrible truth. At 6 p.m., James closed his computer and drove home. His cabin felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved in while he was gone. He made dinner, spaghetti with jarred sauce, nothing fancy, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the forest beyond. In the failing light, the trees looked like sentinels, dark and watchful. Keeping something in or keeping something out, he couldn't say. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Reeves. You missed your appointment. Everything okay? James typed a response. Sorry. Work emergency. Can we reschedule? Of course. Thursday, same time? Sounds good. He'd go to the appointment. He'd tell her about the Madison Garcia case, about finding the missing hiker, about the stress of the search. He wouldn't mention the transformation, the sacred fire, the hunger that walked on 2 legs. She wouldn't believe him anyway, and more importantly, he didn't need her to. He'd carried the secret of the Carsons alone for 2 years. He could carry this one too. But maybe that was wrong, James thought as he washed his dishes and watched night swallow the forest. Maybe carrying secrets alone was how people ended up desperate enough to break taboos, isolated enough to think the rules didn't apply to them. Madison Garcia had hiked alone into wilderness that demanded respect. She'd underestimated the danger, overestimated her skills, and when crisis came, when she'd gotten lost, gotten injured, gotten hungry, she'd made a choice that seemed reasonable in the moment, but led to something unforgivable. James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Found the number for the ranger he'd trained last year, a young woman from Montana named Rachel Brennan, who reminded him of himself at that age, idealistic, confident, convinced that knowing the rules would keep her safe. He composed a text. Hey Rachel, random question. Did they teach you about indigenous taboos at the academy, specifically about Cascade folklore? Her response came 30 seconds later. Not really. Why? James typed. Because the old stories matter. The warnings matter. And if you're going to work in these mountains, you need to understand that some rules exist for reasons we've forgotten. Let me know if you want to grab coffee sometime. I'll tell you what the training manual leaves out. Sounds mysterious. I'm free Saturday? Saturday works. He'd tell her about the Wendigo. Not everything. Not the specifics of Madison Garcia or the hospital, or the way the thing had smiled with filed teeth. But enough. Enough that if she ever found tracks that didn't make sense, or bones arranged in patterns, or smelled that chemical decay in forest where nothing should be dead, she'd know to run. Or if she was brave enough to fight with sacred fire and old words. The secret didn't have to die with him. That was the important thing. The knowledge could be passed down, ranger to ranger, a shadow training that ran parallel to the official curriculum. How to recognize signs, how to prepare, how to burn a Wendigo shell so completely that the spirit couldn't find a new host. Tom Reeves knew now. Rachel would know soon. And they'd tell others, and those others would tell more. And maybe, the next time someone made Madison Garcia's terrible choice, there would be someone ready to respond before the transformation was complete. James finished washing the dishes, turned off the lights, and went to bed. He didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion pulled him under almost immediately, and for the first time in 2 years he didn't dream of the Carsons. He didn't dream of bones arranged in spirals or tracks that shouldn't exist. Instead, he dreamed of fire, clean, purifying fire that consumed everything false and left only truth behind. In the dream, he stood beside the Cascade River at dawn, watching ashes swirl away in the current, and he felt something he hadn't felt since before the Carsons died. He felt like a ranger again, not just someone who enforced rules and maintained trails, but a guardian of the boundary between the human world and the wild places where old laws still applied. It was a heavy responsibility, heavier than he'd understood when he first took the job 11 years ago, but it was also purposeful in a way that filing reports and giving safety briefings never could be. The hunger that walks was real, the stories were true, and someone had to stand between the desperate and the choice that would destroy them. Someone had to remember what the world looked like before GPS and satellite phones, and the comfortable illusion that wilderness was just nature we hadn't tamed yet. Someone had to carry the knowledge forward, generation to generation, so that when winter came and people got hungry and the old taboos seemed like superstition, there was still a voice saying, "Don't. Please don't. Because what you become will be worse than what you'll lose." James Whitmore decided he could be that voice. He could be that guardian. It wasn't the career he'd planned, wasn't the peaceful life he'd imagined when he first moved to the North Cascades, but it was the one he had, and he'd do it right this time. He'd honor the people who died, the Carsons, Madison Garcia, the 2 officers, by making sure their deaths meant something, by making sure the next person who faced that choice knew the truth about what waited on the other side. The hunger never dies, it just waits. But so do the guardians, the ones who remember the old words and keep the sacred fire burning. And as long as someone stood watch, as long as someone carried the knowledge forward, the hunger wouldn't win. Not today, not in his forest, not while James Whitmore still drew breath. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.